He thought choosing another woman would end the story, but he never imagined the woman he cast aside would become the only person his ruthless father would ever truly respect. The crystal chandeliers above the Romano ballroom scattered warm golden light across polished marble floors, turning every smile into something almost too perfect to trust. Nearly 200 guests filled the estate overlooking the Hudson River, dressed in tailored tuxedos and designer gowns, their laughter blending with the soft melody of a string quartet. Every camera turned toward Ethan Romano as he lifted a champagne glass with effortless confidence, the heir to one of the most powerful families on the East Coast, looking exactly like the man everyone expected him to become. Beside him stood a glamorous woman whose sparkling diamond bracelet caught every flash of light, while only a few feet away, unnoticed by almost everyone, Amara Brooks adjusted the silver serving tray resting against her trembling hands. She had spent 11 months working inside the Romano estate as a housemaid, quietly polishing floors, arranging flowers, pressing expensive suits, and making certain every room looked flawless before anyone important stepped inside. She had learned that invisibility could be a kind of protection. If people never truly saw her, they rarely remembered to hurt her. Tonight proved how wrong that belief had always been. Ethan smiled as though kindness had never existed anywhere in his world. "Everyone," he announced, wrapping one arm around the elegant blonde beside him. "I'd like you to meet the woman I'm building my future with." A wave of applause swept across the ballroom. Amara felt every clap land like another door quietly closing behind her. Only a month earlier, Ethan had whispered promises that sounded permanent, promises she had never asked him to make, but had believed because hope often disguises itself as honesty. Now those promises disappeared beneath crystal glasses and expensive laughter. Several guests glanced toward Amara, recognizing her only as the quiet Black Maid who happened to be standing too close to a celebration she clearly did not belong in. A few exchanged sympathetic looks. Others simply looked away. Dignity, Amara realized, often vanished long before tears ever arrived. She lowered her eyes, determined to finish her shift without allowing anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. Then another presence entered the room without raising his voice. Vincent Romano crossed the ballroom with measured steps, his charcoal suit perfectly tailored, his silver hair touched by the evening light, his expression unreadable. Conversations softened without anyone asking them to. Power rarely needed an introduction. His calm blue eyes moved across the room, pausing for only a heartbeat on Ethan before settling on Amara. She did not look back. She simply steadied the tray in her hands and prepared to walk away with what remained of her pride. Ethan laughed again, unaware that the silence growing behind him carried far more weight than the applause that had welcomed him moments earlier. As Amara reached the grand staircase, she stopped, turned only enough for her voice to carry through the suddenly quiet ballroom, and spoke with remarkable calm. "You chose your mistress. I choose your father." No one moved. No one breathed loudly enough to disturb the stillness. Even the musicians lowered their bows. For the first time that evening, Vincent Romano looked directly at Amara, and something almost impossible flickered behind the eyes of the man the entire city called ruthless. 6 months earlier, the Romano estate stood above the Hudson River like a fortress built from stone, glass, and silence. Every sunrise painted its towering windows in shades of gold, but inside, every day followed rules that never changed. Staff members arrived before 6 o'clock each morning, moving through endless hallways with quiet efficiency, polishing marble floors until they reflected the chandeliers above, arranging fresh white lilies throughout the mansion, and preparing rooms that always seemed ready to welcome presidents, billionaires, or people whose names never appeared in newspapers. On her first morning, Amara Brooks stood outside the wrought iron gates with a single suitcase, a neatly folded employment letter, and exactly $48 left in her checking account. Losing her previous housekeeping position after the hotel changed management had left her only weeks away from missing rent, and every interview since then had ended with polite smiles and disappointing phone calls that never came. The Romano estate was her final opportunity, and failure was simply not an option. Sofia Delgado, the head housekeeper, greeted her with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm and the expression of someone who valued discipline above conversation. She explained every expectation with practiced precision. Staff members never entered the family wing without permission. They never discussed anything they overheard. They never interrupted meetings. They never asked questions about visitors. Most importantly, they never attracted attention. Invisible employees stayed employed. Memorable employees rarely did. Amara listened carefully, nodding after every instruction. She had spent most of her life learning how to disappear into hard work. Growing up in Atlanta, her grandmother often reminded her that dignity was something no employer could hand you and no wealthy person could take away unless you surrendered it yourself. Those words had followed her from one cleaning job to another, becoming quieter with time, but never disappearing. By 8 o'clock that morning, she was already dusting an upstairs library lined with walnut bookshelves stretching nearly 20 feet toward an ornate ceiling. Leather-bound books, antique clocks, and family portraits surrounded her, each object carefully positioned as though nothing inside the mansion had ever been accidental. She worked methodically, careful not to disturb even the smallest detail. Suddenly, footsteps echoed across the hardwood floor. Slow, even, unhurried. Before she could step aside, a tall man entered carrying a thin folder beneath one arm. His charcoal suit fit with effortless precision, and streaks of silver-framed dark hair that only added to the authority in his calm blue eyes. She recognized him immediately from the orientation file every employee received. Vincent Romano, the owner of the estate, the man whose reputation seemed to arrive in every room before. He did. Amara lowered her eyes respectfully and stepped against the bookshelf, expecting him to pass without acknowledging her existence. Instead, he paused for only a brief moment. His gaze swept across the freshly polished shelves, the spotless windows, and the vase of lilies she had quietly straightened minutes earlier. He said nothing, not a compliment, not a criticism, just one almost imperceptible nod before continuing toward his private study. The silence lingered long after he disappeared behind the carved oak doors. Sophia appeared moments later carrying fresh linens. "If Mr. Romano walks past your work without saying anything," she whispered, "that usually means you did everything exactly right." Amara allowed herself the smallest smile before returning to work. She had no idea that someone inside the Romano family had already noticed far more than spotless floors and perfectly arranged flowers. The days settled into a quiet rhythm, and before long Amara could walk through the Romano estate without making a sound. She memorized which hardwood floors creaked, which antique clocks chimed 5 seconds early, and which windows captured the first rays of morning sunlight. She believed routine was her greatest protection because routine left no room for mistakes. That belief lasted exactly 3 weeks. Ethan Romano arrived unexpectedly on a rainy Thursday afternoon, pulling a sleek black sports car beneath the circular entrance as staff members hurried to open umbrellas before a single drop could touch his tailored suit. Unlike his father, Ethan carried energy into every room instead of silence. He smiled easily, greeted employees by their first names, complimented the chef, joked with the gardeners, and somehow made everyone believe he noticed people others ignored. Amara watched him only from a distance while arranging fresh flowers in the main foyer, assuming he would disappear upstairs like every other member of the family. Instead, he stopped beside the entry table where she was replacing white roses with cream-colored peonies. "Those look better than yesterday," he said with an easy smile. Amara looked up, surprised that he had even noticed the change. "Thank you, sir." Ethan laughed softly. "If you call me sir every time we speak, I am going to feel 50 years old." Before she could answer, he continued toward the grand staircase, leaving behind the faint scent of cedar and expensive cologne. The conversation lasted less than 20 seconds, yet it lingered in her thoughts for the rest of the afternoon because it had been her first friendly exchange with anyone in the Romano family. Over the following weeks, Ethan appeared more often. Sometimes he asked whether the coffee in the library had been refreshed. Sometimes he thanked her for organizing his office after late meetings. Once he noticed a small photograph tucked inside the notebook she carried for housekeeping schedules. It showed Amara standing beside an older woman on the front porch of a modest house in Georgia. "Your mother?" he asked. Amara smiled gently. "My grandmother. She raised me." Ethan studied the picture for a brief moment before handing it back with unexpected care. "She looks like someone who taught you not to give up." The words caught her off guard because they were true. No wealthy guest had ever looked beyond her uniform before. Soon their conversations became part of ordinary mornings. They remained respectful, brief, and harmless. Yet each exchange made the enormous mansion feel slightly less lonely. Staff members began exchanging knowing smiles whenever Ethan wandered into whichever room Amara happened to be cleaning. Sophia noticed it too, though she never commented beyond reminding Amara to stay focused on her responsibilities. Amara promised herself there was nothing to misunderstand. Ethan belonged to a world filled with private jets, charity galas, and boardrooms overlooking Manhattan. She belonged to a world where every paycheck mattered and every opportunity had to be protected. Even so, hope has a quiet way of growing inside ordinary moments. A shared laugh over spilled coffee. A conversation beside the greenhouse. A simple question about whether she had eaten lunch. None of those moments felt dangerous by themselves. Together, they slowly built a bridge she never intended to cross. From the second-floor balcony, unnoticed by both of them, Vincent Romano paused outside his study and watched the brief exchange below. He said nothing, his expression unchanged, but for the first time since Amara had entered his home, his attention was no longer fixed on the quality of her work. It was fixed on the direction of her heart. As summer settled over the Hudson River, the Romano estate became busier than ever, preparing for charity dinners, executive meetings, and private celebrations that seemed to fill every weekend. Amara continued her work with the same quiet discipline that had earned Sophia's trust, refusing to let the growing attention from Ethan change the routine she had built so carefully. She reminded herself every morning that kindness did not always mean commitment, and that people from different worlds often walked the same hallway without ever sharing the same destination. Yet Ethan seemed determined to erase those invisible boundaries one conversation at a time. He began asking about her favorite books when he found her organizing the library. He noticed that she always carried a small notebook and laughed when he discovered she made handwritten lists instead of using a phone. One afternoon, he surprised her with a brand new leather journal, placing it beside her housekeeping schedule before quietly walking away. Inside the cover, he had written only one sentence: "For every dream you have not given up on." Amara stared at the words for several minutes before carefully closing the journal. It was thoughtful, simple, and impossible to ignore. She thanked him later that evening, and he shrugged as though the gesture had cost him nothing. "You deserve something that belongs only to you," he said. "Everything else around here belongs to someone else." His words lingered in her heart long after he disappeared into another meeting. Weeks passed, and the conversations grew longer. Sometimes they shared coffee on the terrace just before sunrise while the gardeners prepared the grounds. Sometimes Ethan asked about Atlanta, her grandmother, and the tiny church where she had learned to sing as a child. In return, he spoke about growing up inside a family where every decision carried expectations larger than himself. For the first time, Amara saw someone beyond the polished suits and confident smile. She saw a man who sounded lonely despite living in one of the largest homes she had ever entered. Without realizing it, she began looking forward to the moments they crossed paths. She never neglected her work, never ignored Sophia's instructions, and never forgot that she was an employee. But hope quietly found its way into ordinary mornings. Then one evening, Ethan invited her to walk through the estate gardens after her shift ended. The fountains reflected the fading sunlight, while rows of white roses stretched across perfectly trimmed hedges. He spoke about opening a charitable foundation one day, about wanting to do something meaningful beyond business and family expectations. As they reached a stone bench overlooking the river, he stopped walking and looked at her with complete sincerity. "Amara," he said softly, "I have never met anyone who makes this place feel more like home." Her heart beat faster than she wanted to admit. Before she could answer, he gently reached for her hand. There was nothing improper or rushed about the gesture. It was simply warm, respectful, and filled with quiet intention. She did not pull away. In that peaceful moment, the future almost seemed possible. Neither of them noticed the upstairs study window overlooking the gardens until the curtains shifted almost imperceptibly. Vincent Romano stood alone behind the glass, his expression calm as always. He watched his son smile with a confidence that came easily to youth, then lowered his eyes toward Amara, whose face carried equal parts happiness and uncertainty. After a long moment, he turned away from the window without a single word, but for reasons even he could not yet explain. An uneasy feeling settled quietly in the silence of his office. The weeks that followed felt almost effortless, as though life inside the Romano estate had quietly arranged itself around moments neither Amara nor Ethan had planned. He found reasons to remain home longer between business trips. She found herself smiling more often, even during the longest shifts. Staff members noticed the change but respected the unspoken rule of the mansion. They observed everything and discussed nothing. Sophia, however, carried decades of experience that allowed her to recognize patterns before others did. One evening, while folding freshly pressed linens in the laundry room, she looked toward Amara and spoke gently without lifting her eyes. Sometimes the hardest lessons arrive wearing a friendly smile. Amara paused before answering. You think I should stay away from him? Sophia carefully placed another towel onto the shelf. I think people raised with unlimited choices sometimes forget that other people only have one heart. The words settled quietly into Amara's thoughts, but every conversation with Ethan continued to make those warnings feel less convincing. He remembered the smallest details about her life. He asked how her grandmother's arthritis was doing after hearing about it only once. He arranged for fresh peach cobbler to appear in the staff kitchen after learning it reminded her of childhood summers in Georgia. He celebrated her birthday with nothing more than a handwritten card and a slice of chocolate cake delivered before her shift ended. There were no expensive gifts, no grand promises, only thoughtful gestures that slowly convinced her she was seen for who she truly was rather than the uniform she wore each day. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan invited her to visit a local farmer's market after her shift. They walked through rows of fresh flowers, homemade jams, and family-owned bakeries where nobody recognized the Romano name or cared about social status. For several peaceful hours, Amara almost forgot the distance between their worlds. Ethan laughed freely, carried her shopping bag after she bought homemade candles for Sophia, and stopped to listen to a street musician playing an old gospel hymn that reminded Amara of Sunday mornings with her grandmother. Standing beneath strings of white lights stretching across the marketplace, Ethan looked at her with quiet sincerity. I wish life could always feel this simple. She believed him. That evening, as they returned to the estate just after sunset, Ethan hesitated before walking. Inside, there is something I want you to know, he said. I have never felt this close to anyone before. His voice sounded honest enough to silence every remaining doubt in her heart. Amara smiled softly, believing that perhaps love really could cross the boundaries everyone else insisted were impossible. From the library window above them, Vincent happened to notice the two returning together. He watched only long enough to see genuine happiness on Amara's face before quietly closing the curtains. For reasons he could not yet explain, relief did not accompany that sight. Instead, an unfamiliar concern settled heavily in his mind. Experience had taught him that appearances often changed long before people admitted the truth. The following Monday morning offered the first sign that something had shifted. Ethan canceled breakfast with Amara because of an unexpected meeting in Manhattan. Then he canceled coffee later that week. His text messages became shorter. His visits to the staff wing grew less frequent. Every explanation sounded reasonable on its own, yet together they formed a silence that seemed to stretch a little farther each day. Amara told herself not to overthink the changes. She focused on polishing silver, arranging flowers, and completing every task exactly as before. Still, as autumn winds began carrying the first golden leaves across the Romano gardens, she could not shake the quiet feeling that the season was changing in more ways than one. By the middle of October, the Romano estate no longer felt as warm as it had only a few weeks earlier. The same marble hallways reflected the same golden afternoon light. The same fireplaces filled the rooms with quiet comfort, and the same staff carried out their routines with practiced precision. Yet something invisible had changed. Ethan's laughter was no longer heard in the library before breakfast. His evening walks through the gardens had stopped without explanation. Business trips became more frequent, meetings lasted longer, and every promise to make time tomorrow quietly disappeared into another busy schedule. Amara refused to complain. She understood that successful people carried enormous responsibilities, and she reminded herself every day that patience was part of caring about someone. Still, Hope became more difficult to protect when silence replaced conversation. One Friday evening, she prepared a tray of coffee for a gathering in the East Conference Room. As she approached the partially opened doors, familiar voices drifted into the hallway. Ethan was inside speaking with several longtime friends from the city. She intended to continue past the room unnoticed until one sentence stopped her footsteps. "You actually spent months talking to a housemaid?" one man asked with an amused laugh. Ethan answered with a casual tone that sounded nothing like the man who had once stood beside her beneath the lights of the farmer's market. "It was never that serious. She is kind, and she made life around the estate less boring for a while." Another voice chuckled. "Does she think there is a future?" Ethan released a quiet laugh before replying. "People believe what they want to believe. Besides, my future has always been decided long before I met her." Amara stood motionless in the hallway, gripping the silver tray just tightly enough to keep the porcelain cups from shaking. No one raised their voice. No one intended cruelty for its own sake. That somehow made the words even heavier. They were spoken with complete confidence, as though kindness had simply become another temporary convenience. She took one slow breath, straightened her shoulders, and entered the room only after every expression on her face had returned to calm professionalism. Ethan glanced toward her for the briefest moment. Surprise crossed his face, followed by uncertainty, but Amara served each guest exactly as she had served hundreds before them. She wished everyone a pleasant evening, collected the empty plates from the side table, and quietly walked back into the hallway without allowing a single emotion to reach the surface. Upstairs, Vincent Romano stepped out of his office after hearing the conference room door open. He saw Amara crossing the gallery with measured steps, her posture perfectly composed, yet something in her eyes had changed. They no longer carried expectation. They carried acceptance. Later that night, while reviewing financial reports alone in the library, Vincent noticed a small leather journal resting neatly on the corner table. It was the same journal Ethan had once given Amara. Folded carefully inside the front cover was a handwritten note. "Thank you for reminding me that dignity should never depend on someone else's promises." There was no anger, no accusation, only quiet grace. Vincent closed the journal slowly and remained seated long after the fire had burned lower. In all his years of leading powerful people, he had learned that character revealed itself most clearly when disappointment arrived. At that moment, he realized the strongest person inside the Romano estate was not the son destined to inherit his empire. It was the woman who had chosen to walk away from heartbreak without surrendering her self-respect. The following morning arrived wrapped in pale autumn sunlight, but nothing inside the Romano estate felt familiar anymore. Amara reported for duty at 6 o'clock as she always had, tying on her apron, reviewing the housekeeping schedule, and moving through each room with the same steady professionalism that had earned everyone's respect. She polished the grand piano in the music room, replaced fading roses with fresh white orchids, and opened the eastern curtains to welcome the morning light. No one looking at her would have guessed that the quiet hope she had carried for months had disappeared overnight. She had made a decision before the sun rose. She would finish every responsibility with excellence, protect her dignity, and never again confuse kindness with commitment. Ethan noticed the change almost immediately. When he crossed paths with her in the breakfast room, he offered the same easy smile that had once made her heart race. "Good morning, Amara." She returned a calm, professional smile without slowing her work. "Good morning, Mr. Romano. Your coffee has already been placed in the library." There was no resentment in her voice, no sadness, only respectful distance. Ethan frowned slightly as though something invisible had slipped beyond his reach. Throughout the day, he found small excuses to speak with her, asking ordinary questions that once would have led to effortless conversations. Each time, she answered politely before returning to her duties. She no longer lingered. She no longer searched his face for reassurance. The bridge they had built together had quietly disappeared, and for the first time Ethan seemed uncertain how it had happened. Vincent observed every interaction without interfering. Experience had taught him that silence often revealed more truth than confrontation ever could. During an afternoon meeting with senior staff, Sophia requested permission to approve Amara's application for a hospitality management certification program offered in Manhattan. The course required flexible scheduling for several months, and could eventually qualify her for executive management positions in luxury hotels. Before Sophia finished explaining the details, Vincent signed the approval without hesitation. "Arrange whatever schedule she needs," he said calmly. "Her future should not stop at this estate." Sophia blinked in surprise before thanking him quietly. The news reached Amara later that evening while she organized inventory in the linen room. She read the approval letter twice, hardly believing the signature at the bottom. It represented something she had almost forgotten was possible, a future built by her own effort instead of someone else's promises. She walked outside just before sunset, carrying the letter in one hand while crisp October air drifted across the gardens. The fountain reflected shades of amber and gold as fallen leaves floated across the stone pathways. She closed her eyes for only a moment, silently thanking her grandmother for teaching her that disappointment could never define a person's worth unless they accepted it as their identity. Behind the library window, Vincent noticed her standing alone beneath the changing trees. There was sadness in her posture, but there was also strength quietly returning with every passing moment. He realized that while his son had been busy walking away from someone extraordinary, Amara had already begun walking toward a future that depended on no one else's approval. For the first time in many years, Vincent questioned not only the judgment of his heir, but also the legacy he intended to leave behind. Somewhere deep inside the silence of the Romano estate, a decision had begun forming, one that would soon change far more than anyone could possibly imagine. 3 days later, the Romano estate welcomed guests from across New York for the annual Romano Foundation Gala, an evening where business leaders, elected officials, charitable organizations, and longtime family friends gathered beneath sparkling crystal chandeliers to celebrate another year of philanthropic work. Every table shimmered beneath soft candlelight, and a chamber orchestra filled the ballroom with elegant music while photographers captured every arrival. Amara had been assigned to oversee the final preparations inside the grand hall before guests entered. She moved with calm precision, making certain every place setting aligned perfectly and every floral arrangement reflected the quiet excellence that had become her signature. She no longer searched the entrance whenever another luxury car arrived. Her attention belonged entirely to the work before her and to the future she had finally begun building for herself. Ethan entered shortly before the reception began, accompanied by the same fashionable woman who had recently become a familiar face at his side. He appeared confident, greeting guests with practiced charm, yet every few moments his eyes drifted across the ballroom until they found Amara. She acknowledged him only with the same respectful professionalism she offered every guest. The difference unsettled him more than he expected. He had imagined distance would eventually fade into forgiveness. Instead, it had become something stronger. It had become indifference. As the evening progressed, Vincent Romano quietly observed the room from the head table. Years of leadership had taught him to recognize performance and authenticity from across any room. He watched executives compete for attention, investors exchange carefully measured compliments, and politicians deliver polished conversations. Then his attention settled once again on Amara. She treated every guest with identical courtesy regardless of status. She thanked the newest dishwasher with the same warmth she offered distinguished donors. She noticed when an elderly volunteer struggled with a chair and adjusted it before anyone else realized assistance was needed. No cameras followed those moments. No applause rewarded them. They simply revealed who she truly was when nobody expected recognition. During a brief pause between speeches, Sophia approached Vincent with quiet hesitation. "Mr. Romano, I wanted you to know that Amara received the highest evaluation in the certification program entrance interview this afternoon. They said she has exceptional leadership potential." Vincent accepted the information without surprise. "I expected nothing less," he replied calmly. Across the ballroom, Ethan happened to overhear the conversation. A strange mixture of pride and regret crossed his face as he looked toward Amara. For the first time, he realized she had continued growing while he had been too distracted to notice. He started walking toward her, intending to congratulate her, but stopped halfway across the marble floor when he saw Vincent step into her path first. The older man did not speak loudly. He simply extended a small cream-colored envelope bearing the Romano family seal. "Miss Brooks," he said with quiet dignity, "this is not a reward. It is an opportunity that should have been offered much sooner. Amara accepted the envelope with visible confusion. Inside was a letter personally recommending her for the Executive Hospitality Fellowship funded by the Romano Foundation, a program that placed exceptional candidates into leadership positions at some of the country's finest luxury hotels. She slowly looked back at Vincent, unable to hide her surprise. "Thank you, Mr. Romano." Vincent held her gaze for a long moment before answering with complete sincerity. "Do not thank me for recognizing what was already there. Thank yourself for never allowing disappointment to change your character." Around them, the ballroom continued buzzing with conversation, but for Ethan, the room had suddenly become painfully quiet. He watched his father offer respect instead of sympathy, opportunity instead of pity, and he understood that the greatest gift a powerful person could give someone was not privilege. It was dignity acknowledged in front of the world. The applause from the gala slowly faded into the quiet rhythm of another autumn evening. But something inside the Romano estate had changed forever. The recommendation Vincent had placed into Amara's hands was never mentioned as an act of generosity. He refused every compliment from board members who praised the decision, answering each one with the same simple response: "Talent deserves opportunity. Character deserves respect." Those words spread quietly through the foundation, repeated by employees who had spent years believing success belonged only to those born into privilege. Over the following weeks, Amara completed the final interviews for the Executive Hospitality Fellowship. Every evaluator praised her professionalism, her calm leadership, and her remarkable ability to make every person feel valued regardless of position. Not one recommendation relied on sympathy. Every achievement belonged entirely to her own work. On her final morning at the Romano estate, the staff gathered before sunrise in the main foyer. Sophia embraced her warmly before placing a small package into her hands. Inside rested the leather journal Ethan had once given her, now filled with handwritten notes from every member of the household thanking her for the kindness she had shown during ordinary days that many people would have forgotten. Amara smiled through grateful tears, realizing that the greatest measure of a life was not how many important people remembered your name, but how many ordinary people felt seen because of your presence. As she carried her suitcase toward the front entrance, Ethan stepped into the hallway. The confidence that had once followed him so easily had been replaced by quiet humility. "Amara," he said gently, "I owe you an apology. I treated your trust like something that would always be there, and I did not understand what I was losing until it was gone." She looked at him with calm eyes, free from bitterness and free from hope. "I accept your apology," she answered softly. "But forgiveness does not always mean returning to the place where the hurt began." Ethan lowered his head, understanding that some opportunities disappeared not because they were taken away, but because they had not been valued when they mattered most. Before Amara reached the front steps, Vincent approached carrying nothing except his usual quiet presence. He extended his hand, not as an employer saying goodbye to an employee, but as one person honoring another. Amara accepted the handshake with genuine respect. "You once believed this house gave you a future," Vincent said. "The truth is that your character reminded this house what its future should look like." She smiled, thanked him sincerely, and walked toward the waiting car that would take her into the next chapter of her life. Vincent remained standing beneath the stone entrance until the vehicle disappeared beyond the iron gates overlooking the Hudson River. Ethan joined him a few moments later, watching the empty road in silence. "She deserved better," he admitted quietly. Vincent nodded without taking his eyes off the horizon. "She always did." Months later, the Romano Foundation announced a new scholarship honoring hospitality professionals whose leadership reflected integrity, humility, and service. It carried no family name. Instead, it was dedicated to the belief that dignity could never be purchased, inherited, or borrowed from power. Far away, in the lobby of one of New York's finest hotels, executive manager Amara Brooks welcomed every guest with the same grace she had carried into the Romano estate on her very first day. She had never become important because of the powerful people she met. She became unforgettable because she refused to let disappointment change the goodness within her. And on the day their paths finally separated, the world quietly remembered what dignity truly looks like.